Throughout his life, Tommy has always considered his father to be a hero. There was never a time when he let him down because he was kind and charming. As far as he was concerned, that would never change. A tragic event would strike too soon, and he would lose his best friend as a result of his close relationship with his father. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Tommy's father was his best friend. Even though he knew it was cliche, always thought he could turn to him for anything he needed. He never stopped receiving support from his father. Tommy got a call one day from his siblings. Suddenly, immediately they asked him to return home. Their father requested that they live on his property. As soon as Tommy left work, he was on his way home. A trap was laid for him by his brothers as they already looked at his last will and testament. The brothers were not feeling raw or emotional when he arrived home, but rather smirking and grinning. When he asked why they were smiling, they told him his father was no longer around to protect him before he was abruptly evicted. It didn't help that they wouldn't even tell him the contents of the will. He could take his father's partially finished project in the garage if he wanted something. In tears, he looked into the garage. Was he the only one who cared about his father? When he saw his father's project car, he knew what he had to do, he would complete it. It was still his father's death that caused him the most pain in spite of everything his brothers had done to him. A truck had been arranged to transport his car to a new location. His savings allowed him to find a rental property to rent. As he worked on the car, he continued to trudge forward. The best man Tommy Hawthorne ever knew was his father. The love he had for his 3 sons was unbeatable. Even though Tommy's brothers hated him, his father loved him even more after Tommy's birth. And in addition to Tommy's birth, tragedy also struck that day. The experience would never be forgotten by his brothers. It was a day filled with happiness and darkness at the same time. While Tommy was being delivered, his mother sadly passed away. It is understandable that his family was devastated. In the midst of his father's grief, Tommy came into his life and brought him joy. "At least she gave me one final gift before leaving his earth," he told Tommy as he grew up. It was clear that he was the favorite. But 2 contributing factors meant that his siblings never got along with him. Because Tommy got most of his father's attention, his older siblings felt scorned and jealous. Even though they were old enough to look after themselves, they were jealous of the baby. The other factor that made his siblings despise him so much is they blamed him for his mother's death. It could never have been his fault, yet that was the reason they didn't like him. But there were other questions on his mind that weren't even related to his brothers. He wondered why his father left him the car, specifically if the will was to be believed. His brothers told him they were keeping the house and most of the assets. They said that Tommy was getting the car in the garage, and that was it. It really did confuse him. Were they lying, or did his father really leave him so little? Why would his father leave everything else to his siblings? But the truth would have tears streaming down his face. Tommy recalled his childhood with his family growing up. He remembered his brothers always getting into trouble with their school or with their dad, and he was the only one that had ambition. Tommy recalled his brothers dropping out of high school to stay home instead of working hard. They decided to fall back on their father's money. He was a wealthy writer that begrudgingly provided for them all, but Tommy was different to them. Not only did Tommy work hard in high school, but he was now studying at a prestigious university. This is why he didn't rely on his father's money like his brothers did. His father admired him for that. Tommy was nearly done with his master's degree in creative writing. Well, he wanted to turn out just like his father. He grew up on his dad's stories and wanted to pass them down to his children as well as make new ones of his own. But then the lawyers told him the truth. It had been 2 weeks since his father passed. He attended the funeral, which his brother at least paid for with the money they got. But it wasn't over. He was about to get a visit from a lawyer. He heard the fateful knock on his door and opened it to a wolf-grinned man in a suit. He told Tommy that his father had indeed only left him the car, and everything else went to his 2 brothers. He was shocked. What was his plan? Was his father really the man he thought he was? He needed to find the answers he was looking for. But he would only find them after a long, hard road. The car, a Shelby Cobra, had been in the garage for decades, given that all of Tommy's brothers found it there when they were old enough to notice it. Its paint was chipped, the frame covered in rust, and most of its interior missing. So why would Tommy's dad leave him such a thing? Tommy couldn't understand why his dad could do this to him. He'd always worked hard to make the old man proud, even following in his professional footsteps to become an author. After the meeting with the lawyer, Tommy followed his brothers home to talk. He hoped one of them would at least offer to cover his tuition while he tried to figure out the rest of his problems. Having to pay for rent now meant that it would be hard to cover an expensive master's degree. Would his brothers at least have a heart and help him out? Tommy tried to sit on his favorite seat in the living room, but his brothers told him to stand. They had suppressed their distaste for him for the longest while. They didn't want him to get comfortable in his childhood house. Now that the house was in their name and they had 99% of their dad's fortune, he could tell they had already started spending it. They had bought a plasma television and thrown out the old one, as well as buying multiple video game consoles. It was such a waste of money his father would never have condoned. He was furious. Tommy rushed back in to scold them, immediately regretting the decision. "Dad's no longer here to play favorites," he said with a hiccup, wobbling about as he struggled to keep the rifle on Tommy. Get out. Tommy would never forgive his brother for what he just did. Tommy backstepped out of the house. Everyone was laughing at him. Sad and alone, he walked back home and went into his garage to look at what his old man had left him. He couldn't believe that his dad was truly gone. Stepping into the garage and seeing the car would make everything real. Tommy wasn't ready for any of it. He decided to open the driver's side door. Alone again, Tommy sat in the driver's seat with his hands on the steering wheel. His eyes blurred with tears again as loss clouded his mind and heart. The adult man had been crying in the driver's seat for 10 minutes before he came to his senses. He wiped his eyes and looked around the interior of the car. It was then that something in the glove box caught his eye. He reached his hand inside and took it out. The sheet was a whitish piece of paper. It had dog color ends and seemed old in envelope. Curious, Tommy opened the glove box and fished it out. It had clearly been worn over time. The once crisp paper felt fragile, like it could tear quite easily, but he couldn't believe what he saw. The letter was a few years old, judging from its date. It was also written in his dad's hand. It detailed how much Tommy's dad loved him and his brothers. He wanted to try and warn Tommy about what had already happened, but it also relayed the old man's fears over Tommy's brothers' futures because of their dangerous lifestyle. But the letter's last paragraph stated that Tommy's dad had left him $60,000 sealed in the car's trunk. He also left a few plans alongside the money and wanted Tommy to take on a project of his own. As tears streamed down his face as his heart melted, he knew his father wouldn't let him down. But the letter wasn't finished yet. "I only left you the car and this bit of money because I knew you didn't need me as much as they did. They aren't like you and I and wouldn't survive without my money. But there's something special about the car." The letter was only confusing him more. What was his father talking about? He decided to follow his father's last wishes anyway. "Fix this beauty up," the letter read. "There is a private auction in London. Take it there when you are done and call this number." He couldn't let his father down, not even in death. His father had never let him down, so he had to return the favor. He took a deep breath, seeing it as doable since he was done with his school's fieldwork. Tommy went to school and ensured all his affairs were in order. He deferred from the rest of his classes to focus entirely on fixing the car and got to work. He needed help though. He couldn't do this on his own when he knew nothing about classic cars. He had to make a call. The first thing he did was hire experts who knew their way around such a vintage model. The car would rise again from the ashes, but he'd have to fork over more and more money until it was finished. According to the letter from Tommy's dad, he was to take the car to a private auction in London after fixing it. He expected the car to sell for a few $100,000. He didn't care about the money, only that he'd fulfilled his dad's last wish. But as he drove into the private London auction, he realized something. All eyes were on Tommy as soon as his car roared up the driveway. Princes, business moguls, politicians, and celebrities stared at him. His life was about to change. He found the man his dad wanted him to see, and soon his car was among the ones waiting to be auctioned. The bid for Tommy's car began at $1 million, an amount that left him speechless. By the end, it sold for over $5 million, double the amount his brothers got in their dad's will. Tommy couldn't believe it. He'd always trusted in his dad's judgment and felt guilty that he'd been mad before. He knew what he was going to do with the money. Tommy arranged to buy his childhood home before he even returned. He got in contact with the realtor and bought the place with everything inside. Perhaps the old man wanted him to know the value of hard work and persistence. If that was the case, then this was a lesson Tommy would never forget.